welcome into another edition of the GSMC College Football Podcast brought to you by the GSMC Sports Network. It is May 2nd. I'm your host, Tommy Brzee, and we have an awesome show for you today. We're going to start, in fact, the first half of the show actually is going to be a lot about Colorado football. There was a very interesting piece that came out from Max Olson in The Athletic that a lot of people have a lot of opinions on. So I wanted to take the first segment today and kind of just talk about what that article said. It feels like a lot of the quotes might have been taken just at face value and not really, really read the full context of the article. I think it was a little bit more fair than some people are suggesting. So I wanted to get into what exactly it said and kind of some of the reaction to it. But then in the second segment, we'll really get to the reaction fully and kind of what happened on Twitter right afterwards. Some of you might have seen Deion Sanders and Deion Sanders going back and forth with some people about this topic, and it's created quite the stir in college football, so I felt like it would be a good time to, really get into that and give you my thoughts about all of that. But then we'll get back to kind of normal programming here. We'll talk a little bit of a spring overreactions from the SEC. Tom Fornelli over CBS had this idea. I will not steal any of his overreactions, I do promise you that. But I thought it would be a fun thought experiment, so I went through a couple of the teams and broke down kind of what I took away from this spring for those teams. And then we have another Hot Take Thursday for you, and it's all about how important these couple of months coming up, or really these couple of weeks coming up, are very, very important, not only to the players, but to the coaches, and just developing a team that can compete for a national title. So we'll get to all that throughout the show. But before we jump in, I do want to remind you all we get tons of questions and comments throughout the show. And the best way for you all to get your question on the screen, get your comment on the screen, we can have a fun back and forth here, is to use the tip and donation link at the bottom of your screen. GSMCpodcast.net. It's a huge help not only to us here at the network, but to you all. You get to kind of have a fun interactive experience here, ask something that you've been wondering about, maybe call me out on something that I didn't get right or didn't bring up. So it's always fun for both of us when we get to interact a little bit on here. Again, that's GSMCpodcast.net. But let's jump right in and let's talk about this Colorado transfer portal article. There has been a ton of talk around this, and something that has been really just on fire, especially around Twitter the last couple of days. And Deion and Shedeur have gotten into that party a little bit, but we'll get to that as we kind of go. I think there was this big talk around when Deion showed up, the way that he kind of handled his first couple of days at Colorado. They had that infamous video where he walks into a room full of kids that are fairly uncertain about their future and tells them essentially, a lot of you are not going to have positions on this team. A lot of you are going to have to find other places to play. He was bringing his Louis with him, as he says. So that obviously started this off on quite the interesting foot and made a lot of people watch what was going to happen over the next little bit. And what happened was the craziest turnover that I've ever seen, and I think anyone's ever seen in college football history. We saw 53 players leave that program throughout. When he came to the school to the start of the season, we had 87 new guys jump into the program. It was absolutely insane what had to be done during that first year. And that's kind of what this article is about. They talk about the 53 kids that found their way out of the program. They talk about their experiences leading up to having to leave the program and what has happened since with them. Kind of, some have been very successful, some have kind of fallen by the wayside. But mostly the article kind of centers around 6 guys that were kind of integral parts of that team prior to the one last year, the 2022 team, which was 1-11, really struggled. One of the characters, in fact, in this is Josh McCown's son, Owen, who was the starting quarterback for Colorado during that 1-11 season, and then obviously found his way out the door. He was one of the 53 that transferred away. But some of the main people that I really want to get into have some very interesting quotes throughout this, and one of them is Chase Sewell, a player that was on this team for quite some time and definitely did, I apologize for that, and definitely, was a part of this, saw that kind of what was going on throughout this process, and he had some very interesting quotes kind of talking about what happened when he was getting cut, and kind of the atmosphere around the team as he was around it. So first he said he did not sugarcoat it. He was telling me, you're coming off an injury. I don't think you're going to be one of the guys that needs to start this year. We need guys that are going to be ready to play for right now. So I think it's one of those things that's just it obviously set this guy off a little bit on a weird foot. Obviously, these are not going to be easy conversations. The idea that it was going to be sugar-coated probably was not going to be a thing. But I think there's so many different things that I think could play a big part here. And I think one of the things that will be a huge thing in this kind of process, I apologize, I was looking at a comment over here, but I think when you talk about that comment in particular, you see kind of the reality of college football. There are a lot of these conversations that happen across the country every single year. Now, the reality of this situation is he had about 20 conversations in a day that went the exact same way, saying you probably don't have a position on this team, you might want to find somewhere else to play. Maybe he didn't say it quite as nicely as that, but he did a ton of conversations over, a 24-hour period, and then 53 guys kind of slowly matriculated into the portal. So it created this kind of weird divide, it felt like, in the team, and Sewell kind of gets into it when he talks about this. He says, it felt like it was us versus them instead of all of us together. That's the best way he could put it. He said the new guys were kind of against the players that had already been there. It wasn't a great environment. It wasn't a team environment. So I totally understand that. I mean, from the outside looking in, that's what it felt like, right? When you were talking about, Deion bringing his Louis along with him and all of these different things that were kind of thrown out there by him, it felt like it was kind of going to be that approach in at least the early stages of Colorado football, and it seemed to have been. And I feel like I think that's a thing that you wish didn't happen, but when you're bringing in that many new kids and so many kids are walking out the door, so many kids are left over from a team that apparently they had felt like they had really bonded over that 1-11 season and really had found their kind of footing towards the end of it, and then this came in and kind of put all that away, right? Now, Chase Sewell was not necessarily all negative towards Deion. He did say that it wasn't like he was being aggressive towards him or being mean in any way. He was just kind of telling him how it is. That's just kind of the reality of this situation. He was just saying, prove to me that you can play, which was another thing that he threw out there during this conversation. And I think it totally makes sense, right? It's one of those things that I think in college football, we'd love for all of these conversations to go over beautifully and all of these kids to find exactly where they'd love to play and thrive and wherever that situation is. That's not always how it works, right? There has to be tough conversations. There has to be conversations that are going to make guys upset, and that's just kind of the way of things. So Sewell overall, I mean, he found his way to ECU, became their wide receiver one last year, so he's in a great spot, has done some incredible things, and it really felt like it worked out better for him at the end of the day. But definitely some very interesting quotes here where you talk about how this was handled and how, kind of the environment around Colorado at that time. Some of it obviously was necessary. Some of it just kind of had to happen. But some of it not so much, right? Some of it definitely could have been avoided. But one of the big talking points around this, because of what I'm going to talk about in the next segment actually, was a quote that came from Xavier Smith, who is a defensive back, I believe a corner, that transferred out, found his way to Austin Peay, and he kind of talks about his experience when he was eventually cut from the team. And the way it usually went was it would be one player going into a room and talking to Deion, and he would tell them pretty much, pack your bags. Not in that vernacular, obviously, but that's the gist of these conversations. With Xavier Smith, it was a little bit different. He was brought in with another teammate, and he was brought into the room with Charles Kelly, who was the defensive coordinator, who then told him, obviously, that he had to find a new place to play and probably would not be on the Colorado team much longer. So that obviously made him fairly upset, and this was one of the quotes that got a lot of traction on Twitter and on all of the different social pages the last couple of days. He said, I was actually getting mad, like tears coming out of my eyes because, bro, you didn't even try to get to know me. And I think that's, a fair reaction, right? You feel like you've gone through not too long with this new staff. You feel like you've only gotten second team and special teams reps, which was his story, and you feel like you just didn't quite get the fair shake that you deserved. And then to be told, find a new place to play, it all goes, it's not ideal by any means. It's not something that you want to hear. It's not something that, frankly, I don't think it's something that these Colorado coaches wanted to do, but it's kind of something that needed to happen. Now, Xavier Smith is doing just fine for himself. He found his way to Austin Peay, was a freshman All-American last year in the FCS, and is now at UTEP because he followed his coach, Scotty Walden, who got that job. And so it sounds like him and his coach now have a much better relationship and are kind of very, very connected. So obviously fantastic for him. Glad he found a great situation. But obviously this created some waves. This idea that, Deion is handling these things, this type of way, and people started to pass judgment. And we'll get to kind of the exact judgment that was being passed in the next segment, but obviously this was going to create eyes. Deion always creates eyes, and there's plenty of people that would love to tear Deion down. Let's put it that way. I think there's plenty of people that are just kind of waiting for that moment to really pounce, and it feels like this was an opening, and frankly, I don't think it really was, but I'll get to that kind of towards the end here. There was one more interesting quote in here that I want to get to. Jake Wiley was an offensive lineman on the 2022 team and then transferred out shortly after Deion got there. I think he stuck around for spring ball and kind of got a little bit of run, but eventually decided to move on. But one of the interesting things he had was he was talking about his group chat in the O-line group, and he said, in our O-line group chat, one of the offensive line coaches texted the group, said, "Good luck, fellas," and removed them from the chat, removed all of them. It was at least 5 people who removed from the chat. We were like, what happened? So it's kind of this idea that they were handling it as quickly as they possibly could. They weren't super concerned about the optics of how kids were getting let go. They weren't super concerned about, bringing the kid in and letting the kid, have his word in the conversation. So things were going on at Colorado that usually don't necessarily go on. And part of that has to do with just the incredible amount of players that they had to overhaul in this kind of roster craziness that they were dealing with. They had one more story in there about Maddox Kopp, who was a quarterback on that team and found his way to Miami of Ohio, but he was a 2-year transfer or a 2-time transfer, so had to kind of fight tooth and nail with the NCAA. Finally got a temporary restraining order to play in Miami of Ohio's bowl game. So a lot of these guys did have to sit out for a year, and a lot of these guys were under very different circumstances depending on where they kind of ended up. And just to give you an idea of where these guys were, so we had 15 go to the Power 5 out of the 53. You had 22 go to the Group of 5. You had 9 to the FCS level, 1 Division 2, 2 to the JUCO, and then 4 guys just unsigned, have just stopped playing football and are, normal college students at this point. So it kind of shows you an interesting thought process here, because 15 guys that go to other Power 5 schools, you would think have a place on a 1-11 roster who was largely considered the worst Power 5 school in the country a year ago. The Group of 5 kids is kind of a hit or miss proposition. Some are, totally capable of playing at Colorado, some not so much. But once you get down to the FCS Division 2, those kids likely were not going to play on Colorado. And that's not necessarily an indictment of them. I'm sure there are plenty of talented players. I mean, Xavier Smith has made quite the career for himself at the FCS level and has now moved back up. But I think when we talk about roster construction in college football, and we talk about how Deion handles things compared to how other people handle things, and there's a million different ways to go about these conversations and to go about roster construction, especially in a time where you're going to be moving guys around a whole lot, and that's just kind of the way of things. So the big question is, how do you handle it? How do you kind of go about that business? And I think there is a better way to go about it. I think there is a way to be very nice and very caring about these conversations, because it is a tough conversation to have with a kid where you've put in all this effort and now you're telling them essentially pack your bags and find somewhere else to play. It's not a great conversation. I do think there's a better way to go about it. I do think that Colorado maybe cut some corners in some senses in these conversations to make it happen, but there's a huge thing that I feel like people just don't fully understand about this situation. Overturning 53 guys walking out of your room, 87 guys walking into your room, you have to cut corners, especially on things like this, just because roster construction is such a tough thing to do, and piecing together a class that is all over the place and a million new faces and a million guys walking out the door, things had to happen very quickly, and they had to happen. When you looked at that 2022 Colorado team, they had no chance to compete if they kept that same roster but just added in JioSaavn Sanders and Travis Hunter. That just wasn't going to be a reality where they were going to be even a 4-win team like they were in 2023. They would have probably won maybe 2 games. JioSaavn made him maybe have one game that he went absolutely crazy. I don't know. But the reality of this is there were a lot of people that came after Deion for, not caring about his team and not caring about the players and being a little, mean, essentially. And then there were people that came after Max Olson and said that this was bad reporting and he was going after Colorado and he was trying to tear them down. I don't believe either of those things. I think it's insane to think, honestly, both of those things, because the reality is when you're overturning a roster to the degree that Deion had to, sometimes you're going to have to be very blunt, and you almost have to be blunt because you have to get stuff done. There's a million things that have to get done before that team can be ready to go to start the season, and they had to get done quickly. And Deion did, honestly, a pretty remarkable job when you look at how much he had to turn over and what was actually put on the field in the fall. Obviously, a 4-8 record is not what they wanted, but still a pretty crazy turnaround considering all of the things that happened around him. My point being in all of this is just college football, elite sports, all of this stuff, it's cutthroat. That's just the way it is. There's no way around that. There's no way to kind of subside that. This is a professional sport. So Deion, being who he is, where he's going to be blunt, he's going to be direct, and he has a lot of experience in professional sports, he's going to be a little bit more aggressive about these conversations. He's not going to be as, gentle about these conversations because, frankly, last year he just didn't have time to. Now the question is, what happens this year when some of these guys walk out? Does he follow the same way of thinking, and does he kind of continue to do it this way? Because then it could become a problem. I won't argue with that at all. I just think last year was very special circumstances where guys were going to get their feelings hurt, and I wish that wasn't the case, but that's just kind of the way of things. So coming out of this article doesn't really change my opinion of Deion. I knew exactly who Deion was going into this, and I know exactly who he is coming out of this, and it's not much of a different person, frankly. And anyone saying Max Olson is trying to tear down Colorado from this article, I think we've shown, these guys didn't necessarily just tear down Deion. Sewell at the end of the piece said, there's nothing I can really be mad about. I was able to meet Deion Sanders. I was able to be around him for a certain amount of time, and then I found my new place to play. So it's one of those things that we can squabble over whether he should have, put on a little bit more of a kid glove and handle these kids a little bit nicer. But at the end of the day, the roster construction part of it, I have essentially no problem with, just because some stuff just has to happen, and some stuff just has to happen a little bit more quickly and a little bit more aggressively than some of us hope. But that isn't necessarily the end of the conversation, is it? That article was just the start of some of the very, very interesting things that have happened around Colorado football the last couple of days. So we'll get to that and my thoughts about that, because I'm a little bit less inclined to defend Deion on this next part. But stick with us and we will be right back with that.